Um, it's great to be here with all of you, and I'm excited to get to introduce you all as part of this series to a thinker that a modern Jewish thinker that probably many of you have not heard of. His name is Shalom Spiegel. He was born in 1899 in Bukovina, around the border between contemporary Ukraine and Romania. I'll show some maps in a few minutes. And died here in New York City in 1984. Um, and his life and his scholarship spanned many aspects of 20th century Jewish history, a century that he lived through most of. And so I'm excited to tell you about him. I'm just going to ask my husband if my slides are on this laptop for screen sharing purposes. Okay, so just a moment, everyone, because I'm going to put up a slideshow. Sorry about that. It's this hybrid situation here is a little bit challenging. This is not really working so well for me. I didn't really realize
Maybe I can help.
I'm really not sure.
Go to your set mail.
No, I just need, it's like internet troubles. Can you share the screen? Can you just, okay. So you know what? He's going to put up the slides on the other laptop, and I'm just going to begin. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a story, and hopefully, and we will also look at examples of scholarship of a figure who, when you look at the different educational institutes that he attended, when you look at the different things that he studied, it's really hard to pin him down. But he was actually an extremely famous, again, within a narrow world, I guess, of the world of Jewish studies scholarship. He was an extremely famous figure in the study of what was called Hebrew literature. We might now think of Hebrew literature as maybe like the modern writings of Chaim Nachman Bialik, Shai Agnon, things like that. But for him, and in the 20th century, especially in the early to mid 20th century, Hebrew literature was really understood as as a field that encompassed all literature written in Hebrew ever. So including the Tanakh and including Midrash and including Jewish liturgy, piyut, like liturgical poetry, including medieval poetry written in Hebrew, in the Middle Ages, etc. So really kind of anything that you could call literature, and as long as it was written in Hebrew. So he was an expert in this, which is a really vast array of material. And yet when we look in a moment at the slides and we see what he did his doctorate in at the University of Vienna in 1920, completed in 1922, and the various institutions where he studied and taught, he appears to be a kind of Renaissance man, just a figure who had knowledge in many arenas and who knew many different things. And so, like I said, I'm excited to tell you about him. And when Spiegel died in 1984, there was an obituary published in the New York Times, which again, if the slides ever appear on here, yeah, great, I'm ready. Then I'll be able to show it to you in a little bit. So when he died in 1984, one of the things that was pointed out in this short obituary, about 4 paragraphs long in the New York Times, was a lecture that he gave in the year 1957 in New York City at the Jewish Theological Seminary in Morningside Heights, in which included in the audience were Harry S. Truman, at the time the former president, and the Chief Justice, the current at the time Chief Justice, Earl Warren, And I may be able to tell you a little bit about that event, but that was probably his moment of the greatest fame in his life. But as you'll see, he was known by many significant figures really throughout the entirety of the Jewish world of the 19th century. And like I said, I'm just excited to introduce him. So let's turn now to the first slide. So here are a couple of images of Spiegel at various ages. On the left is Spiegel as a young man in the 1920s. And then all the way on the right is an image probably from the 1960s. Um, and some other time periods in between. Go to the next slide, please. Um, Here you can see that Spiegel was invited to submit an entry for himself to the Who's Who in World Jewry in the early 1950s. And so what I'm going to be showing you today is a lot of material from his archive, actually. So this note on the left is, with on a typewriter, filling out the form for the Who's Who in World Jewry, which was published in Jerusalem. Um, there's some information we're not going to look at the details of it now because I will show you many of these details from his life, but I just wanted you to see that he was literally in the who's who. Can you turn to the next slide, please? All right, here is a copy of his birth certificate. Okay, he was born in Unterstanesty, a shtetl, like I said, in Bukovina. You can turn to the next slide, please. Here are some images from this shtetl. These images are preserved by Jewish survivors. So Spiegel's family left Unterstanesty before World War II. They actually left in the 19 teens and 20s. His parents moved to Haifa, and he spent almost a decade in Haifa, which I'll tell you about in a moment. But these images are preserved from Jews who survived who survived the Holocaust, the Shoah, and obviously many Jews also from the region were killed in the Holocaust. Next slide, please. So here you can just get a sense of the region. Again, you can see Bukovina, where he was born, today is partitioned between Ukraine and Romania. And where Spiegel was born, it was in the northern part of Bukovina, near Chernowitz. And at the time, it was in the Austrian Empire, which explains why it was very easy for him to go, as a student, to go study in Vienna at the University of Vienna, because he was part of the Austrian Empire. Next slide, please. Oh, my husband says I don't have to say please. I don't know. What do you all think about that? Um, all right. So here, I just wanted you to see.
It's double nice. Nice of you. Yeah, please, and nice of your husband to say you don't have to.
All right, and here I just wanted you to see a Jewish map. This was obviously a region in which many Jews lived. So here was a map made in 1878 in Hebrew, covering the region of Galicia and Bukovina, which is at the bottom right of the map. So again, you can just see the connection to the Jews of the region and Hebrew language, which was being revived in the 19th century. And Spiegel was born in 1899, and he is going to very much become educated in the context of this revival of Hebrew language, of Haskalah, Jewish enlightenment, Jewish studies scholarship, and also Zionism. So lots of active Zionist youth groups, and the revival of Hebrew language and literature was very much connected also to Zionism in this region. And so that will be part of Spiegel's life. And I already mentioned that his family moved to Haifa in the 20s, which is a pretty early time to emigrate to the region of the land of Israel. And so I'll tell you more about that in a moment. Next slide, please, not please. Okay, so here I just wanted to show you a little bit about his education in Vienna. You can see two institutions where he studied. One was the University of Vienna, where he would pursue a PhD. And also you can see Israelite Theological Educational Institute, the Lehranstalt in Vienna for like basically Jewish studies. So he studied at both places at the university, and then he took all these courses in Jewish studies at this educational institute for the study of Judaism. Next slide. Here you can see his student pass from 1921, which indicates that he was studying philosophy. Next slide, please. You can see his student pass from 1922, which also indicates that he was studying political science. Next slide, please. And here you can see that he took courses with, at the time, a very famous Viennese Jew. His name was Hans Kelsen, who was a legal philosopher, and he took classes on political theory with him, a class on democracy and a class on the political theory of socialism. Next slide. So far you're not seeing the Hebrew literature guy, right? And here you can see from the course catalog that he saved, you can see the courses that he marked up to show that he was interested in them. So courses in the history of philosophy, courses in psychology, courses in literature, and mathematics. Next slide, please. And here you can see that during this era when he was a student, he also was publishing in this Zionist Jewish youth newsletter, okay, or journal, okay? This is called Moriah. It was a Jewish youth monthly published in Polish. And in this particular issue, which was from the 1917, which was from 1917, or the 1917 to 1918 academic year, he published an article in Polish on Avraham Mapu, who you can see on the right, this image of this is a novel in Hebrew called Ahavat Zion, love of Zion, love of Zion, a significant kind of early Hebrew author in the modern period of the revival of modern Hebrew. He had died in 1867, and Spiegel's article was called Avraham Mapu on his 50th anniversary of his death. So you can see that even as a very young man, he was active in scholarship and in Hebrew literature, and in this case, modern. Next slide, please. Now this is a totally surprising, I think, part of his education, which is that his dissertation was on Friedrich Nietzsche, the kind of very controversial, even in that era, in his lifetime, philosopher and critic of religion, and also critic of Judaism and the Jews. Spiegel wrote his dissertation on psychological aspects of art and aesthetics in Nietzsche's thought. Okay, very complex topic. But he studied psychology, as we saw before, during his time in Vienna. And of course, Vienna was Freud's Vienna. So it was a place where psychology was, and psychoanalysis and thinking in all different aspects of psychology was very much in the air. Next slide, please. And here you can see his diploma from his PhD at the University of Vienna. Next slide, please. And that brings us to his next stop, which was Haifa. Okay, so following that education that he received, after he graduated from his PhD in 1922, he moved to Haifa, and he was there till 1928. And in his time in Haifa, he was involved in many important institutions. So he taught in a school called the Beit HaSefer HaReali HaIvri, where he taught Hebrew literature. And this school, we'll talk about it more in a moment, was founded in 1913 and very much in connection with what would eventually become the Technion. I'm sure you've all heard of the Technion in Haifa. So at the time, it was called the Hebrew Technical Institute, also founded in 1913 in connection with this Beit Sefer HaReali. Spiegel taught Hebrew literature in both institutions. He was also involved politically in the labor movement in Haifa. He was also the president of the kind of union of teachers in Haifa. He Also was chosen to be part of the Palestine Youth Delegation to the United States of America in the year 1924 to 1925. So he actually had a brief visit to the United States during that time. Next slide, please. So here you can see the Beit HaSefer HaReali, an old picture of it. It's still in that same building to this day with the kind of dome on the left and then the little spikes to the right of it. And here is a letter in Hebrew that was written on Spiegel's behalf in 1928 when he was planning to come to the United States for just 1 year. And we've all heard this story that 1 year turned into the rest of his life. He was really just planning to come for a year and then to go back, but he wound up getting caught up in the American scene and the American Jewish scene, and he remained in New York after that. And we'll get to his New York period in a moment. But in this letter, which was written by the principal of the Beit HaSefer HaReali, it describes the courses that Spiegel taught and his expertise. And basically it's described that he could teach Hebrew literature from every era, like I mentioned before, between piyut, liturgical poetry that you find in the Sidur or in the Machzor, the Tanakh, to modern literature in Hebrew and other languages as well. And the principal goes on to say that the level of Hebrew language knowledge among their students had risen significantly since the time that Spiegel, in the 6 years that Spiegel had been teaching there, thanks to his work and his teaching. And this was a kind of recommendation that he was sending to the folks in New York, where Spiegel was going to be a teacher at various institutions here. And he wanted to let them know how wonderful he is. Next slide, please. Okay. So I wanted a quick word on the Hebrew Technical Institute of Haifa. Again, the original institution that would become the Technion. Here you can see that there was an article in Nature magazine in the year 1938, volume 141, which was an article about the Hebrew Technical Institute of Haifa. Okay, and I'm just reading to you from the abstract of the article, which you have on the slide here. This is the Center of Technical Training and Research for the Young Jewish Community in Palestine. Hebrew is the language of instruction, but the college is open to all, making no distinction of race or creed, and a few Palestine Arabs have availed themselves of this opportunity. The curriculum is extensive and includes courses leading to university degrees in the technical college proper, a trade school for artisans and foremen, special vocational training classes for refugees, courses for agricultural workers, and evening classes. Okay, and in 1938 there were about 1,000 students there, and and so on. So I just thought you would all find it fascinating that there was an article about this in Nature magazine in 1938. Next slide, please. Here you can see the JTA bulletin from October 1945, indicating that the Hebrew Technical Institute, or then the Technion, was approved under the GI Bill as a place where American veterans could go and study and have their tuition paid for under the GI Bill. So I thought you would all find that fact interesting. This is after Spiegel was already in the United States, but it was just another little aside about the Technion and the / the Hebrew Technical Institute where he taught. And here on the bottom left, you can see a letter from his employer at the Hebrew Technical Institute, which was sent to the Jewish Institute of Religion here in New York, where Spiegel would go and teach, just indicating again that he had been a wonderful teacher there. And this was also in 1927, in advance of his visit to the United States. Next slide, please. Okay. Oh, and this is another just curiosity that I thought I would show you all. Here you can see a drawing of the sons of Haman hanging, and this was a Purim Seuda invitation that Spiegel got in Israel in the year 1927, and it just says, before, just right on Erev Shabbat, come to the palace at such and such time for, to encounter Achashverosh, etc. And it was a joke, a kind of Purim jokey invitation. And I found it in his archive, and I just thought people would find it interesting. So I'm showing it to you. And of course, it's in Hebrew. Go ahead. Next slide, please. All right. Oh, here we can also see that that Spiegel studied Arabic when he was in Haifa. Um, and here you can see that he studied with a guy named Aziz Domet. I've looked into this guy a little bit, and it seems like he was a kind of pro-Zionist Arab living in the Haifa region. He also spent time in Germany, this guy, and he was Spiegel's Arabic instructor. And on the left, you can see that Spiegel was involved in in the 1920s in a kind of attempt at a peace between all the peoples living in the region. We obviously know that that's not the direction that history went in, unfortunately, but we can see that there was this multilingual kind of effort amongst Jews and others to have peaceful relationships. And it's, kind of tragic to imagine if this had been the way the world went, we would obviously live in a much safer Israel and a safer world. But so this is back in the 1920s. Go on, please. Next slide. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so now we're up to Spiegel's phase in New York City. Okay, so in 1928, he came to New York City. And the first place where he started teaching was at the Jewish Institute of Religion, which there you can see an image from that era of the building. And something famous that happened there that was really during the time that Spiegel worked there, and also thanks to him, was I'm sure many of you or all of you have heard of Gershom Sholem, an extremely prominent um, Hebrew University professor from the 20th century, who published great important works in Jewish mysticism, in Kabbalah, and he was like probably the most towering figure at Hebrew University in Jewish scholarship in Israel for many decades. Sholem came to the United States in the 1930s, and he was friends with Spiegel from the years in the 1920s when Spiegel lived in Haifa and in the land of Israel. And Sholem and Spiegel were friends, and Spiegel invited him to come to the United States to give a lecture series. And here you can see it was a 6-part series in the year 1938. And the series was called Jewish Mysticism, Major Trends. And many of you may have heard of the major book that came out of that lecture series, which was published in English, Major Trends in Jewish Mysticism, published in 1941. So I just wanted you to see Spiegel's contribution to the scholarship of Gershom Sholem and the publication of his work. And this is really one of his most important books. Next slide, please. Here's a book that Spiegel published in 1930, very early on in his time in the United States. It's called Hebrew Reborn. And it was about the birth of the Hebrew language in the modern period, the rebirth of the Hebrew language in the modern period, and how Hebrew was revived. And that was the first book that he published in the United States. Next slide. Okay, here I also wanted to mention that he was a public speaker all over the Jewish world in the New York region and beyond. So here you can see from a Buffalo Jewish newspaper in 1935 that he was giving a talk at the Beth Zion Men's Club. And this was common. There are many such documents in his archive of evidence of him speaking just all over. Next slide, please. Okay, here's something interesting. I think many of you have heard of and have books on your bookshelves published by the Shokin Press. Okay, very important Jewish press here in the United States. So the Shokin Press published many, many Jewish books and still does to this day. And it was originally in Germany. And on the left, you can see a letter written in German to Spiegel in 1937, inviting him to the birthday celebration of Salman Shokin, who was the head of the Shokin Press at the time. And that's 1937, okay, in Berlin, in Germany. So obviously we know 1937, it's really not a very good time for Jews, and very soon thereafter, obviously, is going to be the worst of the times for Jews. And Spiegel was invited to this celebration. And I wanted you to see that among the signatories on this letter inviting him are the top signatory is Shai Agnon, okay, the famous Nobel laureate, modern Hebrew writer. And then in the blue ink, you can see Martin Buber's signature, which is also very clear. I'm not exactly sure who all the other signatories are because their signatures are less clear. On the right, you can see a decade later, another invitation to Salman Shokin's birthday. So the previous one was his 60th birthday, and now it's an invitation to his 70th birthday. And here, the celebration is taking place in New York because the Shokin press had moved from Germany to New York to build a new Jewish life and Jewish scholarship in the United States in the aftermath of the Holocaust. And you can see the letter is signed by Nachum Glatzer, who was an important figure at the Shokin Press. Next slide, please. Okay, keep going. I have so many like fun little things, but can't show everything. All right, so this is an image of the Jewish Theological Seminary in Morningside Heights that was taken in 1938. And in 1943, Spiegel was hired to become a professor there. Next slide, please. This was to the great disappointment of Gershom Scholem, whom I just mentioned before. Gershom Scholem, like I said, was a towering figure at Hebrew University, friend of Spiegel, and he desperately wanted Spiegel to come back to Israel and again, the state had not yet been founded. This is in 1942, but he desperately wanted Spiegel to come back to the land of Israel and what would be the future Medinat Yisrael, in order to become a professor of Hebrew literature at the Hebrew University. And in this letter, you can see, this is an excerpt from a letter that Scholem wrote to Spiegel during 1942. By the way, during the war, very interesting to read the letters between them during the war. It was very hard to send letters across the Atlantic Ocean. There were paper shortages and other challenges due to the disruptions of the war. That's a side point. And in this letter, he says that he's very disappointed, congratulations, Spiegel, that you got this great job at the Jewish Theological Seminary, but I'm also desperately hoping for you to come to Hebrew University. And he even tells him that he's almost gotten approval for him to be appointed. But alas, next slide. Next slide again. Spiegel responds to Scholem, saying you can look at the bottom of this, the top part of this excerpt from Spiegel's letter just indicates all the difficulties of mailing things between the land of Israel and the United States. Spiegel's been sending Scholem all sorts of periodicals. They're not arriving. Okay, there's censorship. There are difficulties with the mail in Palestine, censorship in the United States or in Palestine. You can see all this evidence in the letter. But in the bottom of this excerpt, Spiegel says, I regret also that my full Hebrew letter did not reach you. They mostly wrote to each other in Hebrew, just to be clear. They only wrote to each other in English when it was typed letters, because the typewriters were in English. Not that there weren't Hebrew typewriters also, but this was easier. When in Roman letters, so they wrote in English when they were typing, but when they wrote by hand, it was all Hebrew. He says, I regret my full Hebrew letter did not reach you. From it, you would have seen how deeply appreciative I am of the honor shown to me and how positive my reaction was. This is to Spiegel's basically invitation to him to become a professor of Hebrew literature at Hebrew U. He said, working in Jerusalem would be the consummation of my fondest hopes. The hesitations I voice are now fortunately removed with the appointment of some other scholar. It seems to me immoral to block his nomination when he is there on the spot and so eager to teach. So he basically says, thanks, but no thanks. I couldn't take the position away from someone else who's in it, and he's going to remain in the United States. Next slide, please. And here, by the way, is a PS from Gershom Scholem to Shalom Spiegel saying, I would recommend most heartily that you meet my friend, Mrs. Hannah Arendt, Blücher. So that's the famous and infamous, of course, Hannah Arendt. She was friends with Gershom Scholem, although if you've heard the story, their friendship basically ended after the publication of her book about the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem. that's a whole interesting story. We could talk about that maybe if there's time for discussion at the end of this about the relationship between Hannah Arendt and Gershom Scholem. But anyway, this is 1942, and he says to Spiegel, "Please, I recommend that you meet my friend. You will find her a most charming and spirited lady." Next slide, please. Here you can see a letter from Hannah Arendt to Shalom Spiegel in 1941. So this is already before Sholem had written his PS, "You should meet my friend," they had already met. And she basically writes to him, "Sholem has told me to reach out to you. And so here I'm reaching out to you." And so apparently they met up. They were both in New York. We don't have much evidence of a relationship, though. This is the only letter in his archive from Hannah Arendt. Yeah, next slide, please. Okay, here you can see more speaking engagements. Temple Bethel and Temple Israel are proudly sponsoring a series of evenings so outstanding. We are calling them Evenings You'll Remember. So stimulating, so entertaining, so timely. I feel like I should recommend to the Bayit to like borrow some of these advertising slogans for this lecture series. And the entire series of evenings, only $3.60, federal tax included. So a real bargain. Anyway, so Spiegel lectured in this series where you can see other famous figures, Margaret Mead, a famous anthropologist, and at the American Museum of Natural History, and Professor Salo Baron, famous Jewish historian at Columbia University. And this was in the year 1947, this lecture series. Next slide, please. Okay, here I wanted to show you a little bit of his scholarship for a moment. So this is something that Spiegel published in 1950, originally in Hebrew, although it was later translated into English. And it was about the legends, and by this he means, by the word legends, he means something like Agadah, so Jewish kind of narrative, Jewish lore, Jewish stories that appear as interpretations of, as in some way, shape, or form, midrashim, like midrashic commentaries on the Tanakh. Jewish legends are primarily something akin to Agadah or midrash. But here, Spiegel understands this concept, and I'll talk more about legends in a moment. Spiegel understands this concept not just in terms of Chazal, the rabbis, and the Talmud and Midrash, and kind of that era, but also the way that Tanakh was interpreted in a legendary way through other avenues of Jewish thinking, including prayer, including tefillah, including the Siddur, including piyut, liturgical poetry, including the keynote like that we say on Tisha B'Av, for example, on the 9th of Av. So all of this, to the extent that it's engaging with the Tanakh, these are also Jewish legends. So this particular article or book that he wrote in 1950 was about the way that Akedat Yitzchak, the story of the binding of Isaac, of Avraham nearly sacrificing his son, that obviously famous story, the way that story was understood by Jews in the time of the Crusades, by Jews in the aftermath of the mass slaughter of Jews in the context of the Crusades in the year 1096, okay? In Germany and Provence and in Ashkenaz, basically, in medieval Ashkenaz. So the book is really about the way in which a certain concept about the binding of Isaac became popular amongst Jews in that era, which was the idea that actually Avraham slaughtered Yitzchak in the Akedah. He wasn't stopped. But then Yitzchak was revived and brought back to life, okay? And so if I had more time, I could show you how this is grounded in textual evidence. If you look in the Tanakh, you can see why people came up with this idea, because there are certain places where it could kind of look like that might have happened, even though that's not the story. And also, Yitzchak disappears for a while after the story of Akedat Yitzchak. And so there had been a long history of Midrashim that needed to interpret, where did Yitzchak go? Why does he kind of fall out for a while from the Tanakh until the appearance of Rivka and his marriage, etc. And so there had already been other traditions established that he went up to heaven to study in the heavenly Beit Midrash, the heavenly rabbinical kind of house of study. Um, and there were other less kind of mythical versions of what happened, but there was also a tradition that Yitzchak had actually been slaughtered and then revived. Okay, and Spiegel writes about how this became part of certain medieval piyutim, certain medieval Jewish liturgical poems after the Crusades, because it was kind of meaningful for them to think about it in this way. And here's what he wrote. He wrote, the boundaries between Midrash and reality get blurred. So in certain time periods, right? Including in the aftermath of the Crusades. It is not always easy to decide whether the Haggadah, and by this he means Agadah, so Jewish legend, whether the Agadah in praise of the fathers came first, or whether the Haggadah was in turn influenced by the acts prompted by despair and daring of the later descendants of the fathers in exile of Germany and France. By this he means that there's all this praise of Avraham for how he managed to survive the death of his own child, or how he managed to do it. And that's because, Spiegel writes, that in the context of the Crusades, there are all these stories in which, in order to avoid being killed by their enemies, Jews actually killed themselves, including parents killing their own children before they then put the knife on themselves, okay? And we have famous stories from 1096 about describing this in gory and tragic detail. And Spiegel says that it's the boundary between Midrash and reality gets blurred in this context. And this helps explain why all these piyutim emerged in that era that emphasized the pretty rare idea in Jewish history of Yitzchak having actually been slaughtered and then revived. It was to make Avraham more relatable to these people after what they had lived through. Anyway, it's a really fascinating book, and you can read it in English or in Hebrew. The last trial in Hebrew, it's called Me Agadot HaAkedah, from the of the legends of the binding of Isaac, or of the legends of the Akedah. And I'm happy to talk about that more as well. So this was something he published in 1950. Now, it's no coincidence that Spiegel published this in 1950, because there was a link between 1096 and the Crusades and 1950, which was the immediate aftermath of the Holocaust. So it's, as much as Spiegel's writing about those folks who survived the Crusades, writing these piyutim, it's also no coincidence that he is writing about those piyutim in 1950, because again, the boundaries between Midrash and reality get blurred. Keep going to the next slide. Thank you. Okay, here is these parts of this particular piyut by Ephraim of Bonn in the western region of Germany. We don't have time to get into it, so if anyone's interested in actually looking at the piyut in Hebrew and English translation, I can send it to you. So keep going. Next slide, please, and more in the next one. Okay, another piece of Spiegel's work that I wanted to mention was related again to this notion of legends, was his contribution to Louis Ginzberg's Legends of the Jews, a very famous multi-volume series in which Ginzberg, who was a descendant of the Vilna Gaon, so, Elijah of Vilna, who came to the United States and became a Jewish studies scholar, a very brilliant one, and who also taught at the Jewish Theological Seminary with Spiegel. He was trying to find all Jewish legends, all Agadah, all stories that Jews ever told that were still in existence, reflecting on the Tanakh, reflecting on Jewish life and Jewish history. Now, to do this, Ginzberg had to look not just at Jewish literature, but also at Christian literature, because Ginzberg had the idea that in early Christian periods, certain Jewish legends were actually preserved. Legends that had originally been told amongst the Jews, but then had been lost from Jewish writings, that they were preserved amongst early Christian writings. And so, through scholarly means, he also combed not just Jewish history, but Christian history to find authentic Jewish legends that might not have been otherwise preserved in a Jewish context. Anyway, what does this have to do with Shalom Spiegel? He wrote an introduction to the kind of abridged version of Legends of the Jews, this multi-volume work. It was abridged into one volume, more accessible, Legends of the Bible. And Spiegel wrote the introduction, explaining Ginsburg's method, explaining what the idea of a legend is, explaining how legend features in Jewish storytelling, in Jewish history, in Jewish life. So that's another aspect of Spiegel's scholarship. Next slide, please. Here you can see a letter from Dwight D. Eisenhower to Shalom Spiegel in 1948. This is before he's president. Okay, but at the time, Eisenhower was, I believe, president of Columbia University, which is a few blocks south of the Jewish Theological Seminary. And you can see that there was already some kind of relationship in this period. This will become relevant in a moment for the next story that I want to tell. So next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay, oh, here's just a letter from Leo Strauss, who was a very famous Jewish scholar, philosopher, and a political theorist at the University of Chicago. It's a letter in 1956 commending Spiegel's introduction to Legends of the Bible that I just spoke about. So he was saying, I admired especially, he said, I immediately read your marvelous introduction, which is so lucid and informative, et cetera, et cetera. All right, next slide, please. Okay, here I wanted to tell you super briefly about the story I mentioned at the beginning when that was mentioned in Spiegel's brief New York Times obituary when he died in 1984. Special attention was given to this moment in 1957 when Spiegel had given a lecture at the Jewish Theological Seminary, and in the audience were Harry S. Truman and Earl Warren. On the slide here, you can see a letter that Truman wrote to Spiegel after the lecture saying, so that's on the left-hand side here, Dear Professor Spiegel, you do not know how very much I enjoyed your lecture on Amos. So it was on the biblical book of Amos, the from Nevi'im, from the Jewish prophets. He says, you do not know how much I enjoyed your lecture. I know that whole biblical quotation by heart and have used it many times. So Truman really liked the section from the book of Amos that Spiegel had chosen to write about. And then he says, I was wondering if it were too much to set that lecture down in writing and then let me have a copy for my personal files. It was one of the best I have ever heard on the subject of conditions currently affecting the United States. Sincerely yours, Harry S. Truman. Okay, so there's a lot going on in this letter. First of all, Truman loves the letter. Second of all, he asks Spiegel to write it down. It had been delivered orally, actually on Shabbat. There were no recordings of it due to strict Shabbat observance, and it was not written down. So he asks him to write it down, and it's actually thanks to Truman's request that we have a copy now of Spiegel's lecture, which he did indeed publish a year later, but he wouldn't have otherwise if not for Truman asking for it. But second of all, a lecture on the biblical book of Amos was one of the best that Truman ever heard on the subject of conditions currently affecting the United States. So that seems strange. But if we would have time to get into it more deeply, which we don't, we would see that he was talking about a section in Amos that had to do with the superior importance of justice above all. And it's actually a really fascinating reading of Amos. And like I said, like I said before about other of Spiegel's writings, I'm happy to send anyone a copy of this lecture to read on your own if you're interested. But in brief, Spiegel connected it to contemporary affairs in the United States. In the audience were the Chief Justice and Harry S. Truman, and he connected his reading of the biblical book of Amos to a legal philosophy that would support Earl Warren's court in the 1950s, and particularly that would support the Warren Court's recent decision at the time of Brown versus Board of Education, calling for the desegregation of American schools and other institutions. And Spiegel's talk, which was about the Book of Amos, was also using the Book of Amos as the basis for a kind of legal theory and legal philosophy that would support the legal theory of the Warren Court in that era. And that explains why Truman thought that it was the best lecture on the conditions currently affecting the United States. And it also explains why the Chief Justice, who was also in the audience, very much loved this lecture. Keep going to the next slide, please. Okay, these are other letters that Spiegel received after the lecture was published. You can see on the right in Hebrew a letter from Professor Yitzchak or Isidore Twersky, who was the son-in-law of Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, the Rav, writing to Spiegel how much he loved the published lecture on Amos. On the left, you can see a letter from Harry Ostrom Wolfson, also from Harvard University, a famous philosophy professor. Next slide, please. And here you can see from Spiegel's notes about Eliezer HaKalir, who was a really famous medieval Jewish poet and paitan, writing many of the piyutim that we have, that we say to this day, the keynote on Tisha B'Av also, that we'll be saying in a few weeks. So he did a major project on HaKalir. I don't have time to get into it. The last tidbit I want to mention before our time is up is about Spiegel's brother. So next slide, please. This is, by the way, is the New York Times obituary that I mentioned. Keep going to the next slide, please. Spiegel's brother was Sam Spiegel, the filmmaker, who among his films that he produced were The Bridge on the River Kauai and also Lawrence of Arabia, which I'm sure many of you in this audience have seen. So this is Shalom Spiegel's brother, Sam Spiegel, and these are all from Spiegel's archives. He had all these kind of leaflets and pamphlets that his brother sent him, invitations to premieres and things like that. Next slide, please. So this is from the bridge to the River Kauai, where they actually built a real bridge, which was all for the purpose of one scene in the film where the bridge was bombed. So basically, they spent months constructing a real bridge, only to destroy it for one scene that had to be done perfectly because otherwise, the bridge was gone. So contrast that to filmmaking today, where everything is digitized and all the special effects are digitized. So this describes the building of the bridge. Anyway, it's just interesting, but not really my purpose. Next slide, please. So this is from Lawrence of Arabia. Okay, and you can see in the booklet about Lawrence of Arabia a quote from Winston Churchill, deeming him one of the greatest human beings alive in our time. Next slide, please. And here you could see a quote from Chaim Weizmann, okay, Weizmann of the Weizmann Institute. I cherish his, and this is also about Lawrence of Arabia. I cherish his memory on personal grounds and remember with gratitude his help in furthering the cause of the Jewish people. Okay, so you can see perhaps why Sam Spiegel, a Jew born in a shtetl in Bukovina, would have made this film about Lawrence of Arabia. And you can also see the very detailed maps. I think Sam Spiegel wanted to get the history and the scholarship right. Maybe not, it was not unrelated to the fact that he had a brother who was a historian and a scholar. And at the same time, people say that Spiegel was such a great lecturer and performer and teacher, maybe perhaps because he had this brother in the performance industry. Next slide, please. Okay, this was an invitation to the premiere of Lawrence of Arabia in 1962 in Spiegel's archive. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. All right, and here I wanted you to see, this is Sam Spiegel, the filmmaker's birth certificate, which is found in the Spiegel archive in the Library of the Jewish Theological Seminary. Next slide, please. Here you can see his Tu'udat Bagrut from his Gymnasia Ivrit LaNe'arim in Lodz. Okay, so this is Sam Spiegel, again, famous filmmaker, his certificate of studying at a Jewish school in Lodz. Next slide, please. This is his report card, and you can see his grades weren't that good. He got 3 maspikut, sufficient in a lot of things. But you know what? He wasn't the academic in the family. He became the filmmaker. So all is well. But I thought you would all find these paraphernalia interesting. And I think there might be one more slide. Nope. And that's it. We're going to stop here. So hopefully you learned about this really fascinating figure from modern Jewish thought and history, and also a lot of other things about 20th century Jewish history, just from the many places and institutions where he studied and taught and found himself throughout the years of 1899 to 1984. And I'm happy to answer any questions now. Let me unpin now, yeah? Oh, whoops. Oh, well, can you just call on people? Okay. So I see Lance and then Elaine.
Actually, I have two questions. One, what do you think Professor Spiegel, what's his name? Spiegel?
Yeah, I mean, I think he was Spiegel, although we
Spiegel,
actually
yeah.
have Rabbi Joe Brody in the Zoom who knew him. So you can actually clarify for us how he pronounced his last name.
Okay, well, two questions. One, what was his approach to Paul Tillich? Tillich
Did
is
you see that
mentioned,
Tillich
well,
was mentioned in one of the letters?
yes.
Yeah, so they had a correspondence. I can't tell you in a deep sense what he thought of his scholarship. I haven't seen evidence of it, but I can say that they corresponded. And in particular, one really fascinating correspondence that they had was in relation to Gershom Scholem. So, in during World War II, when the Nazis were getting closer to the region of the Middle East that included the land of Israel, when the Nazis were getting closer to Palestine, there was a lot of fear for Jewish life, in particular, I mean, obviously for everybody if the Nazis conquer, but there was a particular fear that there would be mass slaughter of the Jews. And Paul Tillich, who's he thinking about? Gershom Scholem. He is worried about scholarship, and he writes to Spiegel, can we get this guy extradited from Palestine? His scholarship is too important for him to be lost to history. And Spiegel basically writes back to Tillich, it's very nice of you to be concerned, but Scholem would never leave his people in a time of crisis. And let's just hope for the best, but there's no way he would agree to such a plan. And, that was it. So beyond that, I don't know, but I do know that they at least corresponded and had some kind of relationship. And in particular, this was one correspondence that I found.
Your scholarship amazes me.
Well, thank you so much, Elaine. Can you unmute yourself, please?
Yes, this is such an interesting talk. Thank you. I was struck that Truman loved his lecture on Amos, and Truman was somewhat of a biblical scholar. He reread and reread. He never went to college, and I think maybe his education was from the Bible. And I was wondering if you could send it. And also, I noticed as a young man who was wearing a suit, Spiegel was wearing a suit that looks like the kind of suits that Soviet citizens wore. Is this Bukovina part of the Soviet Union at the time?
Well, he left before the Soviets took over. But the Bukovina, the part of it was in the Soviet Union, and meaning meaning part of it is in contemporary Ukraine, which was under the borders of the Soviet Union. But again, in his childhood, it was the Russian Empire, and again bordering with Romania. And it was Bukovina itself. So the borders were shifting. So I have no idea if that's a Soviet suit. That's fascinating, something to look into. But in general, I've heard him described as a Viennese gentleman by other people who knew him later, meaning back to his kind of years studying in Vienna. He very much connected with Vienna. And in fact, his daughter, who's still alive, is 97-year-old retired federal judge named Judge Raya Spiegel Drebin. She was born actually in Vienna, even though they were living at the time in Haifa. It was a very scary time to have babies in 1920s in Palestine, high infant mortality rates, high maternal mortality rates. And so the place that was natural for them to go for the birth of their child was Vienna. So it's another connection. But again, if it's a Soviet suit, I don't know. But in general, he always wore suits and he was a very gentlemanly, kind of European aristocrat type of guy.
Thank you.
Yes, Judy and Estelle. So maybe one of you first and then 1 second. And then I also see Rabbi Brody. So maybe Rabbi Brody, did you have something you want to add to what I just said first? And then we'll take the next questions.
Okay, I was a student of Professor Spiegel, and we lived in the same building, so we had a lot of contact over the years. He was the consummate Viennese gentleman. One story only, the last year that in 64, 4 of us invited him out to dinner. He wasn't up to going out to dinner, so he invited us to his home. And at the end of the evening, the one woman with us, whose husband later became the dean of the rabbinical school at JTS, Beverly Lebo, as we were leaving, he kissed her hand in the very much Viennese. And the rumor is she has not washed that hand since. Because of, he was just a wonderful teacher, a great human being, a great human being.
And one thing I would add to that is that I've read a lot of oral histories from students and people who were at the Jewish Theological Seminary in that era. And I would say that, and again, Rabbi Brody, you can correct or add to this, but not all the teachers in that era, and I'm sure this was not only true in this institution, but in many institutions, not all of them were so nice or respectful of students. And you actually hear a lot of kind of horror stories about certain professors and encounters with them. And one thing that really struck me was with respect to Spiegel, I only found nice things, meaning in a time when there was a lot of not nice things to say about some other of his colleagues, students really found him to be kind and also brilliant. So, you know, that's nice for me because it's nice that when you work on someone, also to think that they were a nice person. Anyway, thank you for adding those stories.
Is it possible to get a copy of his writings on reality and legends?
Yes, I can send the introduction to Ginsburg's Legends of the Bible to anyone. I'll send them to Stephen, and anyone could just reach out to the Bayit and he can pass it on to you, or he can pass you on to me, give you my email address. Either way, absolutely.
That would be great. Thank you.
Any other questions? Judy, hold on. And I don't know, Rabbi Brody, if you were muted, if you were saying something. Judy, did you want to say something? And then Rabbi
I just
Brody,
want to say you did a very fine presentation of a man who made great contributions to Jewish scholarship and to creating a generation of leaders. And I think you did him justice. Thank you.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. And also I've learned stories about him from you, which is a really nice link because not so many people who knew him are still alive. And so it's really exciting to get to hear stories from people who knew him and the ones that you've told, including what you just shared here, which was new to me. And then recently you shared some things with Stephen that he shared with me, which were also new. And then in the past, other stories you've told me. So it's really great. Thank you. All right. Any other questions, comments?
Yes. Can you hear
Okay,
me?
go ahead. Yeah, we don't see you, but we hear you.
Okay. You can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. First of all, thank you so much. And also thank you, Rabbi Brody, for, you're making him come alive. so to speak. The one question, since I kind of come from a background, lost family in the Shoah, I just wonder if such an influential man, did he know about what was going on in Europe, and did he have any involvement in trying to save Jews?
So and again, Rabbi Brody, you can add to this, I think. He was obviously, people in New York knew. They knew what could be known. What could be known to them in New York, which is to say that they knew that it was really bad. They knew Jews were being killed. They didn't necessarily know all the details that emerged only after. But he was deeply involved with Jewish refugees, trying to help them, especially trying to help them settle, find jobs, and especially he was deeply involved in the attempt to kind of revive and reconstitute Jewish scholarship in the United States after Jewish scholarship, which is such a crucial part of preserving Jewish memory, preserving Jewish history, and what it even means for us to be Jewish to this day is to have that link to the past. So much of that was centered in Europe, and so much of it was something that the Nazis really attempted to destroy, including burning books and looting so much material and destroying so much material, and also murdering many important scholars. And so the ability to reconstitute Jewish studies scholarship in the United States, and also in the land of Israel, by the way, as well, which, as you can see, Spiegel was connected to that, was a crucial part of fighting back against what the Nazis did to Jews. And many of the people who came and reconstituted the scholarship were themselves survivors. And so it's not an answer of whether he specifically was able to save people or get them visas during these details I don't know, but I do know that he did a tremendous amount of work, as much as he could, to help refugees and to preserve the work and fight back against Hitler kind of in that way. All right. Thank you all.
Yes, yes.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
You too.
Thank you.